Hey everyone, you're listening and watching Rashkin Report, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Katya Soldak, who is a New York-based journalist and the editorial director of Forbes Media's, sounds fancy, doesn't it, International Editions. Wow. Katya is the director of documentary The Long Breakup and author of memoir essay, This Is How Propaganda Works. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and this program originates from Wisconsin. And Katya's movie, The Long Breakup, is going to be one of the movies featured at our local right here in Beloit, Wisconsin, BIF, Beloit International Film Festival, which takes place from 24th of February until, make sure to get this right, until the 5th of March. And one more disclosure, I'm in no way connected to BIF other than I go and see movies, and sometimes I volunteer. And just thought that this would be a really perfect opportunity to combine the interests that this channel usually pursues, which is discussing the current events and foreign affairs, especially in the regard that they connect to Russia and Ukraine, and our local art scene right here. So this is just perfect. Katya, I'm very excited to welcome you to Rashkin Report.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here.
Absolutely. Well, let's, I don't know how to, I usually like to congratulate people, but seems like this is a result of a lot of suffering, and not just for you, but for Ukrainian people, that this movie remains relevant, even though it was made at this point 2 or 3 years ago, but it still is something that is part of the conversation. So I guess on that level, I congratulate you. How do you feel now knowing that this movie that talks about the history of Ukraine's independence is still relevant, perhaps more relevant today than ever? How do you feel about that?
Well, I have a couple of conflicting feelings. One feeling is that I'm very glad that I was able to capture the moment in history when Ukraine was transforming from being a post-Soviet country into an independent country. And I was just lucky to document that. When I started filming, I didn't know what kind of changes Ukraine would go through. So it was just a pure documentary making process. And the second feeling that is kind of conflicting is that I feel like unfortunately, Ukraine entered a completely new chapter right now, and my film is more like it's a prequel to this new chapter. And there are a lot of very strong, very powerful films are made now or have been finished by now that they're just showing what Ukraine is right now and what is going to happen, and the war and atrocities. And it's a very different journey from what my film is taking you on. And in that sense, I feel like my film covered something and it may still be relevant. But unfortunately, this past year changed things so drastically that anyone who watches it has to keep in mind that this is just the chapter that ended and brought Ukraine to a place where we are now, but it is not about today's Ukraine. That's the part that I think is important to understand. It's like a historic documentary in a way at this point.
You know, it's been a long journey, over 30 years of Ukraine's independence from Russia, from Soviet Union, from its past. And do you feel that the country is moving is it moving in the right direction? There's been so much talk about corruption in the country and different leaders that were taking the country seemingly backwards. But now for the last year of war, of the big war versus the war that's been taking place since 2014, since annexation of Crimea and some of the Eastern territories, do you feel that Ukraine can become part of Europe, European Union, of all those, Western powers. Is it closer to Europe or is it closer to Russia?
Well, if anyone watches my documentary, I hope that they will see the answer. Even before this horrific war that started a year ago, I think the answer was pretty clear. In 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea and Donbas territories, it was already clear that the change has happened, and the answer is very obvious. Ukraine is a European country that wants democratic future with all the liberties and free market economy and democratic leadership. That's what Ukraine always wanted. And in 2014, it became very profound that there is no way back, that Russia lost its power. The country that from the very beginning demonstrated tendencies to go in a completely different direction. It's just Russia's influence was too strong, and the old Soviet leadership was still around. But people are people, and the society developed in its own way over the past 30 years, even in the 90s, when Russia ended up with Putin, and at the end of the 90s in 2000, and then things became very different path for Russia. Ukraine was always on a path somewhere else. It's a democratic state with a very vibrant society, and leadership is leadership, corruption, government, it's not the same as the rest of the country. It's 40, at that time, it was closer to 50 million people in the 90s and the early 2000s. They just a very different breed of people. And I just, think that the doubts or questions about that, they all vanished, especially over the past year. It is a country that is very democratic, that is going to fight for its right to choose its future. And it's not just the government, it's actual people. And that's what makes it very unique.
Something you just said that caught my attention, which is a very different breed of people. And when we look from the United States, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference, because it seems like Russians, Ukrainians, the language seems similar. People ask me often, is there a big difference between the language? How do you describe the difference between Russians and Ukrainians?
I don't know how to answer this question. If we were talking a year ago, I think I probably would have it in me to answer these questions. But at this point, I just think this is, I can't even answer this question, because it's not something that requires explanations. If you talk about culturally, Russia is an empire. The Soviet Union was dominating. So in America, it's very natural that everything is viewed through very Russia-centric prism, and other countries, including Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus and all the other countries, they're viewed as some kind of appendixes to Russia. And the conversation about cultural appropriation or colonization, it just started. You will see changes that will happen to the views in America, in American academia world, in the universities, how the faculties are going to change, how the departments are going to change, how the names like Russia and Eurasian studies are going to get different names. It's already happening. It just didn't reach the masses. But this dominance of Russian culture and calling Ukrainian artists and Ukrainian writers Russian artists, it's just the heritage of the colonizer. It's just the heritage of the Soviet Union, and big changes are going to come. And I don't think I need to answer these questions right now in our conversation, because I think these tectonic huge changes are happening, and it just takes time.
So it's more about Ukraine being a part of, like, a colony of Russia, and now that it, 91, that it finally broke away and started going back to its own path, is what created more and more clear separation between the two. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, but at the same time, I think the history is so filled with oppression and blood and ethnic cleansing and genocide of Ukrainians that the 90s were just the beginning of it. And it's not like the Soviet past was erased in the 90s. You know, if you've seen my film, the monument to Lenin was still standing on the main square in Kharkiv in 2014, whenever I was filming that little part of the film. The mentality was changing, but on some cultural level, some symbols were still okay. Ukraine just developed in its own way because it was not controlled by the government the same as Russia was. But at the same time, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the country, in that case, I would say Russia did not go through anything like Germany went after World War II. So the criminal regime of communism was not explained to anyone. It was sort of like put aside, hoping that maybe it'll vanish, and then all the attributes of it came back. And in that case, Ukraine just had to fight it over time, intuitively. And then the decommunization happened after the Maidan revolution in 2014, 2015, when some streets were changed, you know, some communist symbols were not welcomed anymore. But that was already, you know, the third decade of independence after 1991. So lots of things were developing organically, but it was still the product of more liberal society and different mentality.
One of the reasons people suspect that Putin may have decided to go into a full-blown invasion now is because he feels, perhaps justly, that Ukraine is slipping away. But maybe it slipped away in 91. In a sense that, was there a time when Russia could have conquered Ukraine, or once Ukraine became its own country, becoming again part of Russia became an impossibility militarily, economically? Was there a window of opportunity for Russia, or was there none? What do you think?
Well, historians probably would have a more detailed answer to it going back 300 years ago or more, but Russia never had a chance to keep Ukraine without putting a lot of efforts into controlling it. This country, in this case, this country is Ukraine. Ukraine is full of painful, bloody moments in its past when Russia tried to control the country. Before the Soviet Union, during the Soviet Union, oppressing, repressing, killing. As soon as there would be a moment when the Soviet grip was loosening up a little bit, the Ukrainian cultural elites, they would always kind of rise up, and then the Kremlin had to oppress them again up until the Soviet Union collapsed. There was never a time when Ukraine was okay to be joined by Russia. It was a lot of effort to keep Ukraine within the Russian orbit and to destroy its statehood. And it just didn't work, and it would never work. It's a big country with a huge cultural heritage, with a very vibrant society. Historically, and I'm not a historian, but even I know that it was never worshiping a strong leader or a czar. It was run by Cossacks in the past, when freedom, democracy was still an element of society. When a lot of Ukrainians left and started living abroad in Ukraine, in America or in Canada, the diaspora was always strong and uniting and doing anything to preserve culture and traditions and independence. And I don't know about Russia. It's not my place to talk about what Russians were doing after Bolshevik Revolution, but I know that Ukraine always had global support, always. In the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, there were people who just waited for the Soviet Union to collapse so they could come back to Ukraine and help Ukraine to become a democratic society. And in the 90s, democratic and modern society. And in the 90s, a lot of people who I meet all the time now, they came back to the 90s to bring the expertise. They didn't come to get a mail order bride, or they didn't come to sell some computers and make money. They came to bring Western expertise to the country of their ancestors. And it's a very different mission. It's not just conquering the market to sell consumer goods. It's actually bringing what you always wanted to bring to your motherland. And I don't like the word motherland, but okay, to your country, to help it develop and grow. And maybe it was not in a systematic way. And maybe the Soviet government that was sort of lingering around in the 90s did its own thing. But the society, actual people who loved and cared about Ukraine in very large numbers, I would say. It's not just 2 or 3 people from New York. It was a whole bunch of people from Canada, from anywhere, from Midwest, from East Coast, from West Coast, coming back to Ukraine, starting media, developing enterprises, bringing something new to the government, trying to reform or start new schools and universities. You can't fight it. It's, you know, global expertise versus just Soviet closed off society that doesn't open up to minds and DNAs coming from other parts. I don't know. What would you bet on? I would bet on open society and free market and brains coming to Ukraine versus closing society and trying to control it as much as you can and repress.
You know, I agree with you that Ukraine diaspora is much stronger and united than Russian one. It really, I find it fascinating because, well, I mean, there's so many people in Russia. There's so many people that left Russia, but they just don't seem to work in the same community ways that many other diasporas do, including Ukrainians. And so on that level, I think Ukraine has actually a lot of support and organized support world over from people who, you know, trace their roots back to Ukraine. And that's one big remarkable difference between 2 cultures that I just see myself. You know, we were both born in former Soviet Union. I was in Moscow. You are from Kharkiv, I understand. And I was basically brainwashed into thinking that Moscow is like the center of the world, and everybody who speaks with an accent, there's something, you know, they're a little backwards. They're just, they you know, they don't speak good Russian, and that's very foundational. And it creates this kind of a feeling of condescension, and it's terrible. You know, it's something that I had to overcome, and many people, I think, still struggle to overcome, to understand that just because somebody is not from some big metropolitan center or, you know, whatever, it says something. But how do you feel about this relationship between the Ukrainian identity that's been crushed for decades, that's been explained to everyone that this is not how you're supposed to speak, that's not how you're supposed to behave, and then it turned out that apparently it is kind of more advanced, because the Russian culture, the Russian language is actually leading people towards putting up with the totalitarian regime, to putting up with a dictator, to being able to withstand their army committing war atrocities. Is there some kind of a lesson there?
The lesson is it was an empire and it was trying to colonize other countries. So lots of things were put in place to promote this kind of mentality, to bring down other cultures, to allow them to exist, but in more peripheral way, like some kind of countryside culture that has some kind of right to exist, but, you know, we dominate from Moscow. I think the thing is that I do touch upon this a little bit in my film. And for me, because I did not study any of that, I did not, I was just a person who's going through this journey together with some of my people, including my parents. And this relations with Moscow and with Russia actually is reflected a little bit in my film, because anyway, I don't know who's going to watch it or not, but my family had roots in Russia on my mother's side. And it was a big deal to break up with that part of life. And I experienced myself going to Russia in the summertime and being treated the way that you described for my accent and whatever. But at this point, it doesn't even matter. we moved on, like I moved on. All these things and these little, things that maybe seem unfair or they were a little hurtful, it was a colonizer, and that's what they did. And just because some very little uneducated person in some Russian village who never read a book would make fun of my accent, it doesn't matter, because it is part of a larger problem. And that's, I think, what we should be looking at, because it's still there, it's still around, as you said, in Wisconsin, or in some other areas, maybe less populated with Ukrainian and exposed to, especially now, like refugees coming. It's still a little, there is a question and not clear, like, what is the difference between the languages? Sometimes they don't know that Lviv, is Ukraine. Sometimes they think it's part of Austria. Like somebody would say, oh, my grandparents are from Austria. Where are they from? They're from Lviv, but it's becoming less and less of a problem. And I think once the actual decolonization happens on the level of education and culture and in museums and in movies, in music, things will be okay. I think the eyes are just opening. Ukrainians have known it for quite some time, or were coming to it, like in my case, in my own way, trying to analyze, read something. But I think right now there is a big eye-opening movement that's happening. And I don't think it's going to be just about Ukraine. I think the same is going to be about some other parts of former Soviet Union that maybe were not. We talk about Central Asia sometimes. We talk about Farsi and Tajik language. And turns out, I've learned a few days ago that it's actually kind of the same language. I don't know much about that culture. I don't know much about the history, but I understand that this idea that this big brother came to these undeveloped territories and brought them culture and language, this is just, pardon my language, BS, and part of the colonization mentality. Though those countries that became part of the Soviet Union did not choose to be part of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet government had to put a lot of oppression and repression to keep them under their control. And Ukraine just became more profound in that sense. That's all.
No, I think that's really right on, because colonization, empire, those concepts are really relevant to understanding Russia today, and for me to understand my past, as well as to realize that, I was young cannon fodder growing up in Russia, and I was lucky to have been taken out of there, and been given a chance by my parents to think of, through these things and to understand them for myself. I'm very excited, Katya, because you are a professional journalist, and you're professional, well, dare I say it, American journalist. And you're working for Forbes, and you're kind of like in this, and you're providing the Ukrainian perspective, but combined with, I would say, American professionalism. How do you view journalistic coverage of Ukraine, both since 2014 and specifically in the last year?
Well, recently, I think it has improved a lot, but during this past year, I think there were a lot of ups and downs in the way that the information was presented and the headlines were created. I know for a fact that not every editor was familiar with the history, with the dynamics, and it took a while to, I think, for major mainstream publications in America to get to a place where I think I don't see these outrageous mistakes anymore in the way that they present things. But there was a period of time when Russian propaganda was still strong and flourishing, and lack of information and understanding of the dynamics was still affecting the coverage in national media, in mainstream news. But I would say that for now, it improved. And I think people got more educated, and some people traveled, if not to Ukraine. When I say people, I mean media people. At least they got close to Ukraine, maybe to the border, spoke to actual Ukrainians. So I think in that regard, it became more informed. And I said, not as many mistakes as I used to see. So that's that. In terms of coverage of the war, You can cover daily what's happening, but at the same time, it's important not to lose sight and keep talking about the atrocities that happened in Ukraine. It's very easy to dismiss it when we are in America and we're far. We're just separated by a lot of ocean, a lot of water, a lot of land, and human nature is not designed to expose themselves to traumatic information, traumatic images all the time, kind of like shut off after a little while. But it still happens. The Russian missiles still kill children and innocent civilians, and a lot of children were still separated from their parents and kidnapped and deported and forcefully relocated to Russia. What happens to those children? Each life is a tragedy, and that is really important to pay attention to, because one thing geopolitics and another thing thousands and thousands of broken lives.
One of the big differences I see between the Western way of approaching either a news story or life versus Russian view is what I call ethic of good deeds or ethics of virtue versus ethic of strength. And with ethic of strength, if you are strong enough to do something, well, then you're just in doing. You do whatever you want because you're strong enough to do it. On the other hand, we have a different understanding of doing the right thing for the right reasons, for the right results. Do you feel that this kind of understanding of the different value system, and no matter what it's called, is starting to get through to people, or do people look at Russia and go, oh, they're just like us?
I don't think I understood the question.
Do you think people understand that there's some fundamental, that there's some really big flaws in the way Russian people, frankly, are raised in understanding that strength might makes right, that this approach that if I can subjugate another country, then I can do it, because if I'm able to do it, then I have the right to do it. It's kind of a bigger story beyond the immediate atrocity that happens today, yesterday, or tomorrow. It is a bigger story. Do you feel that that story is starting to is getting out there, or is it still people are confused and think that if Russian people just had a better leader, for instance, then they would be just fine?
Well, it's a very loaded question, and I think that where I am right now, I truly, just because I am in New York and I meet a lot of Russians and I have some editors from Russia, but I truly don't care anymore. We need to take care of Ukraine. Ukraine has declared to the entire world that it's a nation of over 40 million people with a very strong desire to fight for its sovereignty and independence. And all the other things, they kind of get pushed aside. Russia is Russia. Whatever they're going through, we'll look at it. Maybe not me, because in my case, I still want to focus on Ukraine. But the mystery of, Russian soul and leadership and whatever, this is like a luxury to talk about right now. We're going to put them aside, because I think it's already clear. Ukraine is not a small satellite country that you can just come and grab. It's fighting, it's losing lives, but also that big country that has lots of land, underdeveloped land, houses with lack of toilets and whatever. It's just doing some really bad things, killing people, ethnic cleansing, genocide. This is what we should remember. And everything else, it's maybe later we'll talk about it. But right now we need to stop killing people. We need to stop genocide. But this past year brought Ukraine to a place where I think even in America, people who were quite indifferent to Eastern Europe or Ukraine, they started realizing that Ukraine is actually a country with a very strong voice. And we have this president who travels around and speaks in a way that it touches people, and he means it. It's those words he says about democracy or about freedoms and fighting for the land and fighting for the security of Europe. Believe it or not, and I'm super skeptical because I'm a journalist, I know that he means it, because he represents not only in this case Ukraine, but also there are all these countries on the border with Ukraine, the Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, what else is there? Romania, Czech Republic. They're horrified of Russia, and they know that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of everybody else who's a little bit further from Ukraine. And if you talk to those people, you will see they were the first ones in line to help, because they don't want to be next. And they don't care that Russian economy is going down or not going down. They stole enough billions to buy weapons somewhere and terrorize people on the border who, close to them. So in that case, when Ukrainian president says that Ukraine is on the front lines for Europe and for the values of the whole civilized world, these are not empty words. They're actually words that have a lot of meaning. But at the same time, if we talk about Ukraine in the context outside of this war, since 2011 or 12, I already lived in the United States, and I traveled to Ukraine all the time for assignments, to shoot my film, to write some stories. So I met with a lot of people, not just my family and friends, but I met with entrepreneurs, with activists, with teachers, whoever, over the course of several years, I've interviewed a lot of people. And it was very clear that that country was so progressive, especially in the big cities like in Kyiv, for instance. They had these incubators where there were these startuppers, people who would develop apps or products that everybody is using now. If you talk about Grammarly or PetCube or Preply or Revolut or the Reface app, they originated in Ukraine by Ukrainian founders some of them way before Maidan Revolution. They were always interested in creating product that could win the world or larger market, and they wanted to speak English so they could communicate with people in America or wherever they would get the fundings. But they would also speak Ukrainian. When I interviewed them, most of the people who were these young 20-something, maybe 30-year-old entrepreneurs, they would speak Ukrainian, even though some of them were from Kharkiv, where people, it's not Western Ukraine at that time, but we're talking about 2012, before Maidan. Imagine how many things changed after Maidan, how much capital came to Ukraine, how many people came from Ukraine to America and started working on some developments of some interesting products or developing markets, or journalists came to. Ukraine was always that kind of country. So it doesn't matter what Russia is doing. Ukraine just developed in its own way. And if we take it out of the context of the war, it is a big country with a lot of human potential. And finally, I think the world started to see it. And I think, unfortunately, it took this bloody war for, larger population to pay attention to this.
Katya, this is very interesting, and this is where I go. But you work for Forbes, so that makes sense. That your deep awareness of the business climate of Ukraine, and then I think that war is bad for business. Does that mean that there's pressure from business community for the war to end, no matter what, no matter how, as long as the war is over, or is there an understanding that really for business to thrive, Ukraine has to win?
For business, it's better if there's peace, security, rule of law, and very strong democratic society with market economy. So this is where business wants the situation to be. And that is only possible with a complete military defeat of Russia. So the rest of the world can live in the society where the rule of law works, and people know that missiles are not going to be flying, and no one is going to come in 2 years or 3 years from now and grab another piece of land because they need to raise their ratings in their own closed concentration camp-like society. So in this case, I think the interests are aligned. And I'm not saying that everybody's great, that all the players are equally, morally great, but I think the consensus and the alignment of the interests between the people of Ukraine, between people who want to do business in Ukraine, in Europe, anywhere in the world, is still aligned in the sense that we need to bring peace, and it can only be done on the right terms, with Ukraine's victory and putting Russia back to a place where it's not going to present a threat to the world.
That's really great to hear. Katya, final question. What lesson or what conclusions would you like your audience to take away from the movie? What do you want them to talk about as they leave the theater, so to say?
Well, I think for people who don't know much about Ukraine, it would be just very educational to watch. Anything that you can learn about Ukraine, you can just watch, 85 minutes, and then you would know anything about the way, even some history behind it and some transformation in people's minds, you will know that. But it's important to know that this film was finished before this all-out war started a year ago. So it's about Ukraine before the war. The war that I'm mentioning is the war that started in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. The devastation was there, lives were lost, but it was not on the scale it is now. And my city of Kharkiv that people would see is completely destroyed now. It's, landmarks, universities, beautiful historic sites, they are destroyed. So in a way, my film preserves Ukraine the way it was, and it was already beautiful. And the new chapter that we're living in right now will be documented by someone else. And the takeaway would be, this is how Ukraine became to be the country that's fighting Russia right now.
Katya Soldak, thank you so much for your time and for this movie. And I hope everyone who is able will go and check out The Long Breakup. And my guest today was Katya Soldak, a New York-based journalist and editorial director of Forbes Media's International Editions, director of The Long Breakup, and author of memoir essay, This Is How Propaganda Works. Thank you so much for being our guest today. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin. Hope to see you again. Take care.
Thank you, Yuri. Thanks for watching.